You have never actually spoken to a narcissist. Not really. You have spoken at one and they have spoken at you, and somewhere in between you both walked away thinking you had a conversation. You did not. Here is the uncomfortable truth. What feels like connection with a narcissist is usually a performance, and you are the audience. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why every conversation with a narcissist leaves you feeling unheard, confused, and strangely exhausted, even when nothing seemed wrong on the surface. So let me ask you something before we go further. Think about the last real talk you had with someone difficult in your life. Did they ask you a single question about your day? Did they remember what you said last week? Or did the conversation somehow every single time curve back to them? Hold that thought, because what I am about to explain will change the way you hear every conversation you have from now on. If this is already sounding familiar, comment the word Mira below so I know you are still with me. I want to see how many of you have lived exactly what I am about to describe. And if you want the rest of this series on narcissistic patterns, hit subscribe now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who are still confused about what is happening to them. Let us start with the basic definition of what a conversation actually is. A real conversation is an exchange. It has rhythm. One person speaks, the other listens, processes, responds, and there is a kind of emotional back and forth, almost like a dance where both people are adjusting to each other. That is what psychologists call reciprocity. It is the foundation of every healthy relationship, whether it is a friendship, a marriage, or a simple chat with a coworker. Now here's the problem. Reciprocity requires something that a narcissist, by definition, struggles to produce consistently, and that is empathy. Not the kind of empathy that lets them read your face and know something is wrong. Many narcissists are excellent at that. That is called cognitive empathy, the ability to intellectually understand what someone else might be feeling. What they typically lack or have in a diminished, unreliable form is emotional empathy, the ability to actually feel with you, to sit in your experience alongside you without needing to make it about themselves. Without that second piece, a conversation cannot be a real exchange. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes a stage. Think about the last time you tried to share something difficult with a narcissistic person in your life. Maybe you were stressed about work. Maybe you were grieving something. Watch what happens next, because this pattern is so consistent it is almost mathematical. Within 30 seconds, the topic shifts. Suddenly, they had a worse day. They had a bigger loss. They handled a similar situation so much better than you are handling yours. This is not a coincidence, and it is not rudeness. It is a structural feature of how they process conversation. Everything you say gets run through a single filter, and that filter asks one question only. What does this mean for me? This is why a narcissist cannot hold space for you. Holding space means staying present with someone else's pain without redirecting it, without fixing it, without making it about your own experience. It requires the narcissist to sit in a position of not being the center of attention, even for a few minutes, and that position feels unbearable to them. So the conversation gets hijacked, gently at first, then completely, until you are somehow comforting them about the problem you originally brought to them. I want you to notice something else, because this is where it gets interesting. Narcissists are often very good talkers. Charming even, articulate, quick, sometimes genuinely funny. So why does it feel so empty afterward? Because fluency is not the same as connection. You can produce a river of words and still never actually meet the other person in the conversation. What is happening instead is something researchers sometimes describe as a monologue disguised as a dialogue. They are not exchanging thoughts with you. They are performing a version of themselves for you, and your job, whether you realize it or not, is to be a responsive audience. Nod, agree, admire, react. The moment you stop performing that role, the moment you disagree or redirect the conversation back to your own needs, something shifts in the room. You may notice irritation, impatience, a subtle coldness. That shift is the tell. Let us talk about listening, because this is where most people get confused. A narcissist can appear to be listening intently. Eye contact, nodding, even repeating back a phrase you said. But listen closely to what happens next. Instead of building on what you said, they use it as a launching pad to talk about themselves. You mentioned you had a rough week at work, and within a sentence they are telling you about their own career struggles at length, in detail, with no return trip back to you. This is sometimes called conversational narcissism, though the term applies more broadly than clinical narcissism itself. The point is this: listening in a real conversation is in service of understanding the other person. Listening in this pattern is in service of finding the next opening to speak. Here is something that might surprise you. Many people who deal with a narcissist for years start to doubt their own perception of reality, specifically around conversations. You start to wonder if you are the problem. Maybe you talk too much about yourself. Maybe you are needy. Maybe you are asking for too much from a normal relationship. I want to be very clear here. If you consistently feel unseen after talking to someone, that is data. That is not you being too sensitive. That is your nervous system correctly registering that an exchange that should have gone two directions only went in one. Now let us talk about a pattern that trips a lot of people up, and it is called future faking inside conversation itself. This is when a narcissist in the middle of a talk promises change. They will listen better. They will ask more questions. They see what you mean, and they are going to work on it. In the moment, this can feel like a breakthrough. Finally, you think they understand. But watch what happens in the next conversation. The pattern resets completely. There is no memory of the promise, no behavioral follow-through, because the promise was never really about changing the pattern. It was a tool to end an uncomfortable moment where they were being asked to reflect on their own behavior. Reflection, real reflection, requires a level of humility that punctures the self-image. Many narcissists work very hard to protect. Let us go deeper into why this happens, because I do not want you walking away from this thinking narcissists are simply selfish people who choose not to listen. It is more complicated, and honestly, more tragic than that. Underneath the grandiosity is usually a profoundly fragile sense of self. The self-image being protected in every single conversation is not solid. It is closer to a structure held together with mirrors and scaffolding, constantly at risk of collapsing under any information that contradicts it. A real conversation, where another person's needs, opinions, or feelings take priority even briefly, can feel to that fragile structure like a threat. So the mind does something almost automatic. It redirects, it centers, it protects. This is why disagreement with a narcissist rarely stays simple. You can raise a small, reasonable point, something as minor as disagreeing about what restaurant to go to, and somehow the conversation escalates into something that feels wildly disproportionate. That escalation is not really about the restaurant. It is about the perceived threat of being contradicted at all. Being wrong, even about something trivial, can register on an emotional level as an attack on the entire self-image. Now, here is a pattern I want you to be able to name the moment it happens, because once you can name it, it loses a huge amount of its power over you. It is called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Here is how it shows up in an ordinary conversation. You bring up something that hurt you. The narcissist denies it happened the way you described. Then they attack, pointing out flaws in you, bringing up old mistakes, questioning your memory or your motives. And finally, almost seamlessly, they position themselves as the one who has been wronged in this exchange. Suddenly, you are apologizing to them for bringing up your own pain. If you have ever left a conversation confused about how you ended up comforting the person who upset you, this is very likely what happened. It is not a conversation at that point. It is a redirection maneuver. and it is remarkably consistent across different people who exhibit these traits. Let us talk about a subtler version of this, something that happens in day-to-day, low-stakes conversations, not just big confrontations. It is called topic hijacking, and it is almost invisible if you are not looking for it. You are talking about your weekend. They mentioned their weekend was better. You are talking about a book you are reading. They tell you about a better book they read. You are talking about a health scare you had. They had a scarier one. Individually, none of these moments seem like a big deal. That is exactly why the pattern is so effective and so exhausting. It is death by 1,000 small redirections, and over months and years, it teaches you, on a subconscious level, to simply stop bringing things up. Not because you consciously decided to, but because some part of you learned that sharing rarely lands anywhere. I want to pause here and talk about something that is easy to miss, which is what happens to the person on the receiving end of all this over time. Many people start to shrink their own conversational presence. They talk less about themselves. They ask more questions, deflect more attention outward, essentially adapting to a role of permanent supporting character in their own relationships. This is sometimes called fawning, a trauma response where you appease and accommodate to keep the peace and avoid conflict. If you recognize this in yourself, I want you to know it is not a personality flaw. It is an adaptation, a very intelligent one, to an environment that consistently punished you for taking up conversational space. Let us talk about silence for a moment, because silence is also a conversational tool, and narcissists use it with precision, whether consciously or not. The silent treatment is one of the more obvious versions. You bring up a concern, and instead of a response, you get stonewalled. No engagement, no acknowledgement, sometimes for hours or days. This is not simply someone needing space to process, which is healthy and normal. This is withdrawal used specifically to punish you for raising an issue, to make the emotional cost of speaking up so high that you learn not to do it again. It is control disguised as distance. There is also a subtler cousin of this pattern that shows up mid-conversation, and it is called stonewalling in real time. You are mid-sentence, and you can feel the emotional temperature in the room drop. Eye contact disappears. Responses become one word, flat, disengaged. You find yourself talking faster, trying harder, over-explaining, because some instinctive part of you is trying to re-earn engagement that has suddenly been withdrawn. This is one of the most disorienting experiences in a conversation because it happens without any explicit hostility. Nothing was technically said. But the message lands anyway. Stop talking about this. Now, let us talk about something a little different, which is grandiosity inside a conversation, because this is the version most people associate with narcissism, and it deserves its own moment here. This is the person who cannot simply tell a story. Every story becomes an opportunity for a subtle, or not so subtle, display of superiority. They were smarter than everyone in the room. They handled the crisis better than anyone else could have. They were the only one who saw the problem coming. At first, this can be charming, even impressive. Confidence is attractive, after all. But over time, in real conversation, you start to notice that there is no room in these stories for anyone else to be competent, insightful, or central. Every story is quietly, sometimes not so quietly, about how remarkable they are. Here is something that connects a lot of these patterns together, and it is the concept of narcissistic supply. In conversation, this means the exchange is being used primarily as a source of admiration, validation, or attention rather than genuine connection. You can sometimes feel this happening in real time. There is a specific kind of question that is not really a question. Was I not incredible in that meeting? Did you see how I handled that? Do you know how rare it is to be this good at what I do? These are not invitations for your honest opinion. They are requests for a specific answer, and if you do not provide it, the emotional temperature can shift quickly. I want to address something a lot of you might be thinking right now, which is Does this mean narcissists are simply incapable of ever having a real conversation? And the honest, nuanced answer is, it depends on the severity of the traits in the specific person. Narcissism exists on a spectrum. Some people have narcissistic traits without meeting criteria for a full personality disorder. And in lower stakes, low ego threat situations, they can absolutely have moments of genuine reciprocity. The pattern tends to intensify specifically around topics that touch the self-image. Talk about the weather and things might flow normally. Talk about a mistake they made, a way you were hurt by them, or a moment where someone else outshined them. And watch how quickly the conversational structure changes. Let us talk about gaslighting for a moment, because this deserves careful, precise language, since it gets used loosely online. Gaslighting, in the clinical sense, is not simply lying or disagreeing. It is a pattern where someone consistently and specifically undermines your confidence in your own perception, memory, or sanity over time in order to maintain control of the narrative. In conversation, this looks like flatly denying things that were said only minutes ago. It looks like insisting you are remembering wrong, that you are too sensitive, that you are making things up, that you always do this. Individually, any one of these statements might be a normal moment of disagreement. Repeated as a pattern, specifically deployed whenever you raise a concern, it becomes something much more corrosive. It is not about winning an argument. It is about making you doubt your own ability to trust your own mind, which conveniently makes every future concern you raise easier to dismiss. Now here is a question worth sitting with. Why does any of this work? Why do so many intelligent, insightful people stay in these conversational patterns for years without naming them? Part of the answer lies in something called intermittent reinforcement. If every single conversation was cold and one-sided, most people would leave quickly. But that is rarely how it works. There are genuinely warm moments mixed in. Moments of real charm, real attentiveness, real connection. Just often enough to keep hope alive that the pattern will change, that this time will be different. This unpredictable mix of warmth and withdrawal is, psychologically speaking, one of the most powerful conditioning patterns that exists. It is the same mechanism that keeps people pulling a slot machine. The uncertainty itself becomes the hook. Let us talk about apologies, because this is another place the pattern reveals itself with almost perfect consistency. A real apology has a specific structure. It names the specific behavior, it acknowledges the impact on the other person, and it does not immediately pivot into a justification or a counter-complaint. Listen closely to how apologies unfold in these conversations. I am sorry you feel that way. I am sorry, but you also do this. I already said I was sorry. Why are we still talking about this? Each of these is a conversational escape hatch, technically containing the word sorry, while doing none of the actual relational work an apology is supposed to do. Over time, you start to notice that conflict never actually resolves. It simply gets paused until the next time. I want to bring in one more pattern here because it explains something a lot of people struggle to articulate, which is why these conversations feel specifically exhausting, not just unsatisfying. It is called cognitive load. In a healthy conversation, you can relax into a natural rhythm, trusting that the other person is tracking the emotional thread alongside you. In these conversations, a huge amount of unconscious mental effort goes into managing the other person's emotional state while you are talking. You are choosing words carefully. You are watching micro-expressions for signs of irritation. You are pre-softening anything that might sound like criticism. This constant monitoring is invisible, exhausting, and almost never named because it becomes so automatic you stop realizing you are doing it. That is why you can walk away from a perfectly pleasant sounding conversation feeling completely drained. You were not just talking. You were managing. Let us talk about something called word salad, because once you have heard this term, you will start noticing it everywhere. This is what happens when a conversation, especially a confrontational one, starts to spin so fast with contradictions, tangents, and rapid subject changes that you lose track of what the original point even was. You raise one clear concern. Within a minute, 5 other topics have been introduced, half-remembered grievances, unrelated complaints, sudden pivots to completely different subjects. By the time the conversation ends, you cannot even remember what you originally wanted to say. This is not always a deliberate strategy. Sometimes it is simply what disorganized defensive thinking looks like under perceived threat. But whether it is intentional or not, the effect on you is the same. Confusion, exhaustion, and a creeping sense that maybe the original issue was not that important after all, when in reality it simply got buried under a landslide of unrelated noise. Now, let us talk about something that trips up a lot of people early in a relationship, and that is the difference between love bombing and real intimacy in conversation. In the beginning, conversations can feel extraordinary, intense eye contact, rapid disclosure of deep feelings. Statements like "nobody has ever understood me the way you do," or "I have never told anyone this before." It feels like instant, profound connection, and honestly, it can be intoxicating. But real intimacy is built slowly, through repeated small moments of being truly seen over time. What I am describing here is something faster, more performative, designed to create a powerful emotional bond very quickly. The tell is not the intensity itself. The tell is what happens later once the initial phase passes. Does that same depth of curiosity about you continue? Does the interest in your inner world hold steady, or does it fade the moment the pursuit phase is over and the redirection back to their own needs begins again? Real intimacy deepens with time. Performed intimacy tends to peak early and then quietly decline. Here is a pattern worth naming specifically because it is subtle and it shows up constantly in everyday exchanges. It is called one-upping, and it is different from simple enthusiasm about shared interests. Healthy conversation includes moments of relating through shared experience, where someone says, "Oh, that happened to me too," and then genuinely turns the focus back to you. One-upping does the opposite. It uses your story purely as a springboard to establish superiority. You mention a stressful work deadline. Instead of asking how you are holding up, you hear about a deadline that was far more brutal, handled with far more skill, under far more pressure. The conversation never returns to you. It cannot, because the entire function of the exchange was to establish a hierarchy, not to share an experience. Let us also talk about how narcissists respond to your achievements in conversation, because this is often more revealing than how they respond to your struggles. Watch closely the next time you share good news. Genuine excitement should look like specific questions, follow-up curiosity, maybe even simple uncomplicated joy on your behalf. What you might notice instead is something much flatter. A quick, almost obligatory, "that's nice," followed immediately by a pivot to their own recent success, sometimes one that conveniently outshines yours. Or you might notice a strange minimizing comment, a small dig disguised as a joke, something that takes just enough shine off your moment that you second guess whether it was really worth mentioning. This is sometimes called covert undermining, and it is one of the clearest signs that someone experiences your success, not as something to celebrate with you, but as a subtle threat to their own position. There is also a pattern of playing dumb inside a conversation, which is worth naming because it can be genuinely disorienting. This is when someone suddenly seems to forget context they clearly understood minutes earlier, specifically when that context would require them to take responsibility for something. You explain a boundary clearly. Later in the same conversation, they act as though they never heard it, asking you to explain it again, as if starting from zero. This is not always a memory issue. Sometimes it functions as a stalling tactic, a way of resetting the conversation to avoid actually engaging with an uncomfortable point, Let us talk about hot and cold cycling within conversation itself, because this deserves its own moment. In a single conversation, you might experience someone swinging from warm and engaged to cold and dismissive and back again, sometimes within minutes. This unpredictability keeps you in a heightened state, constantly recalibrating, trying to figure out which version of them you are talking to right now, and adjusting your own tone accordingly. Over time, this teaches you to become hyper alert during conversations, scanning for shifts in temperature the way you might scan weather for signs of an incoming storm. That hyper alertness is exhausting, and it is rarely acknowledged as a direct result of the conversational pattern itself. People often blame their own anxiety without realizing the anxiety is a reasonable response to genuine unpredictability. I also want to talk about triangulation because it shows up in conversations in a way that is easy to miss until you know what to look for. This is when a third person gets brought into a conversation, not for context, but as leverage. Your friend agrees with me. Even your own mother thinks you overreact. I talked to someone else about this and they said you were being unfair. Whether or not these claims are even accurate, the function is the same. It shifts the conversation away from the actual issue and toward a manufactured sense that you are outnumbered, that your perspective is somehow the unreasonable one in a room full of people who supposedly see it differently. Let us talk about entitlement inside conversation, because this pattern often hides in plain sight, disguised as simple confidence. There is a specific way some people speak that assumes agreement before it is even offered. Statements delivered as though debate is not really on the table. Requests phrased in a way that makes saying no feel almost socially impossible. You will notice that pushback, even gentle, reasonable pushback, tends to be met not with curiosity but with visible surprise, as though the very idea of disagreement had not been considered a real possibility. This entitlement is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is quiet, almost pleasant, which makes it even harder to name in the moment. Here is something else worth mentioning, because it explains a specific kind of exhaustion many people feel after these interactions, and that is the moving goalpost pattern. You address a concern exactly as it was described to you. Instead of resolution, a new, slightly different complaint appears, then another, each one just different enough that no single conversation ever actually concludes with things feeling settled. This can make you feel like you are perpetually almost getting it right, always one adjustment away from finally satisfying the other person, which keeps you engaged, apologizing, and trying indefinitely. Let us talk briefly about humor, because sarcasm and jokes can also function as a conversational weapon, often with built-in deniability. A cutting comment gets delivered with a laugh, and if you react to the sting of it, you are suddenly the one being too sensitive, unable to take a joke. This dynamic allows genuinely hurtful things to be said directly to your face, repeatedly, while any objection to them gets reframed as your emotional overreaction rather than a reasonable response to an unkind comment. I want to mention boundary testing as well, because this happens specifically inside conversation, often in small, almost invisible increments. You state a boundary clearly. In the very next exchange, that boundary gets gently pushed, just slightly, to see whether it holds. If you do not reinforce it, the boundary quietly erodes a little more the next time, and the next, until something you were once firm about has slowly dissolved entirely without any single dramatic moment you could point to as the cause. So what do you actually do with all of this? I am not going to pretend there is a simple fix that transforms these conversations into deeply reciprocal ones, because in many cases, that transformation is simply not available, especially without the other person recognizing and actively working on these patterns themselves, which is rare. But there are things within your control. The first is naming the pattern internally, even if you never say it out loud. When you notice a topic hijack happening, Simply recognizing it in real time takes away a huge amount of its disorienting power. You stop wondering if you are crazy and start seeing the mechanism clearly. The second is adjusting your expectations of the specific relationship, not out of bitterness, but out of accuracy. If deep emotional reciprocity has not been available in this relationship for years, it is worth being honest with yourself about what this relationship can and cannot offer you, so you can seek that specific kind of connection elsewhere rather than continuously trying to extract water from a well that was never built to hold it. The third is something called gray rocking, a technique often used specifically to reduce conflict with someone who feeds on emotional reactivity. It means offering minimal emotional material in conversations where you know engagement will only be used against you. You stay pleasant, brief, and neutral without offering the vulnerable details that tend to get weaponized later. This is not a strategy for every relationship. It is specifically useful in situations where you cannot fully exit the relationship, such as co-parenting or certain family dynamics, and you need to reduce conversational volatility. The fourth, and possibly the most important, is rebuilding trust in your own perception. If you have spent years in conversations where your reality was consistently questioned, it takes deliberate practice to trust your own read of a situation again. Writing things down after difficult conversations can help. Not to build a case against anyone, but simply to have an anchor, a record of what was actually said, separate from whatever version gets rewritten later. Before we close, I want to circle back to something I said near the beginning, because I think it deserves repeating. A real conversation is an exchange. It has rhythm, reciprocity, and space for both people to be fully present. If you have spent years feeling like conversations with a specific person leave you unseen, confused, or strangely responsible for their emotions, that feeling is not a flaw in you. It is information. Your nervous system has been quietly telling you the truth the entire time, even when everyone around you insisted things were fine. Understanding these patterns will not necessarily change the person on the other side of them, but it changes something in you. It gives you language for an experience that used to feel like static, like confusion with no shape. And once something has a shape, you can finally start making decisions about it, rather than simply absorbing it over and over again, wondering why every single conversation leaves you more tired than the one before. If any part of this described a conversation you have had this week, I want you to sit with that for a moment instead of scrolling past it. Notice which pattern felt the most familiar. Was it the topic hijacking? Was it the silence used as punishment? Was it the apology that never actually landed? Naming it is the first real step out of the confusion. I also want to leave you with one more distinction because it matters more than almost anything else I have said today. None of this means every difficult conversation you have ever had was with a narcissist. All of us, on our worst days, interrupt, get defensive, or make a moment briefly about ourselves. The difference is pattern versus exception. A healthy person can be shown how their words landed and will adjust, apologize genuinely, and change the pattern over time. What we have been describing today is a consistent repeating structure that does not soften with feedback, does not change with time, and resets itself after every apparent breakthrough. That consistency is the real diagnostic marker, far more than any single conversation ever could be. If you take one thing away from today, let it be this. The exhaustion you feel after certain conversations is not weakness, and it is not you being difficult to please. It is your mind accurately detecting an imbalance that words alone were never going to fix. Trust that signal. It has been trying to tell you the truth for a long time. Tell me in the comments which pattern you recognize the most, and if this explains something you have been struggling to put into words. Subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. And you deserve to finally understand what has actually been happening in these conversations all along.